3 days after I buried my husband, I found a storage unit rental agreement in his name, signed 4 months before he died at a facility 11 miles from a house we never lived in. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for his passport because the funeral home needed a copy of it for the paperwork nobody warns you about. Instead, I found a folder labeled in his handwriting, New Start. Inside it, a lease application under his name alone, a bank account I'd never seen with a balance that made my stomach drop, and a checklist, an actual checklist, with boxes checked off for moving out of our house. The last box unchecked read, Tell Marissa. He never got the chance. Or maybe he did, and something happened before he could. Either way, the man everyone at that funeral called devoted, called steady, called one of the good ones, had spent the last 4 months of his life quietly building an exit door out of our marriage, and I only found out because he died before he could walk through it. If you've ever discovered that grief and betrayal can live in the same house at the same time, stay with me, because what I found in that storage unit was only the beginning. My name is Marissa Doyle. My husband was Colin, 39, an operations manager at a logistics company, the kind of man who alphabetized the spice rack and remembered which of my coworkers had a birthday coming up before I did. We'd been married 9 years. We had a rescue beagle named Otis who slept between us every night, and Colin was the one who got up at 5 a.m. to walk him rain or not, because he said mornings were for thinking. We weren't perfect. What marriage is. We'd had a rough stretch 2 years earlier after a miscarriage that neither of us talked about the way we probably should have, but we'd come out the other side of it, or so I believed. We'd started planning a kitchen renovation. We'd booked a trip to Charleston for our anniversary, and 6 weeks before he died, Colin had cried at his cousin's wedding during the vows in a way that made me squeeze his hand under the table. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand that nothing about our life looked like a marriage that was ending. Colin didn't pull away. He didn't get distant or cold or start working late in any way I noticed. If anything, in his final months, he was more attentive than he'd been in years. He started cooking dinner twice a week. He texted me during the day just to say he was thinking about me. I know now that a man can be tender with you and still be planning to leave you. I didn't know that then. Colin died on a Thursday night in October. His car went off the road on a bridge overpass near his office, a stretch he drove 5 nights a week. No other vehicle involved. The report cited wet pavement and a worn tire tread. It closed within 9 days. I didn't question a word of it. Not until I found the folder. The storage unit agreement was dated in June, 4 months before the accident. The bank account opened the same week had built up to just under $11,000 through automatic transfers of $200 every payday. Money I never once noticed missing from our joint account because Colin had always handled the transfers between accounts as the numbers guy in our marriage. The checklist was the part that undid me. It wasn't dramatic. It was almost clerical. Find apartment transfer utilities, talk to lawyer Ra. House tell Marissa, written in the same handwriting he used for grocery lists. As if leaving me was a task sandwiched somewhere between renewing the car registration and scheduling Otis's vet appointment. I called the storage facility the next morning, gave them Colin's name and unit number, and asked with a calm, I didn't feel whether I was authorized to access it as his surviving spouse. The woman on the phone hesitated in a way I was starting to recognize the particular pause of someone who knows something and doesn't want to be the one who says it. Ma'am, there's actually a second name on that unit's access list, added in August. Whose? I'm not able to share that over the phone. You'll need to come in with the death certificate. I drove there that same afternoon. The name on the access list was Bethany Okafor. I didn't recognize it. Not at first. It took me 2 days of quiet, careful searching, the kind you do at 2 a.m., with a mug of cold tea going untouched beside your laptop to place her. Bethany Okafor was a project coordinator at a logistics firm 2 buildings down from Colin's office. They'd worked together on a joint supply chain initiative that started according to a LinkedIn post I found in May, 1 month before the storage unit, 1 month before the checklist began. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I'm not proud of some of it, but I think it matters that you understand how much a person can unravel when the story they believed about their own life turns out to be false. I went through Colin's phone records, the ones I hadn't thought twice about requesting for the funeral paperwork. Text and call logs going back 6 months showed a number I didn't recognize appearing with increasing frequency, sparse in May, near daily by September. The final call to that number had come the night he died at 8:12 p.m., lasting 14 minutes. He'd left our house that night saying he needed to run to the office for a report due the next morning. I called the number myself, hands shaking so badly I had to redial twice. Bethany answered. When I told her who I was, there was a long silence, and then she said something I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. I told him he had to tell you before it went any further. I told him I wasn't going to be the reason your marriage fell apart in secret. She agreed to meet me. Not at a coffee shop she insisted on that said she owed me a real conversation, not a public one where I'd have to perform composure for strangers. We sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot, and she told me the truth as she understood it. She and Colin had grown close over the joint project that he'd told her his marriage had felt over since the miscarriage that he'd been planning slowly, quietly to move out and separate before pursuing anything further with her, that the storage unit was meant to be temporary housing for his things while he found an apartment. He called me that night, she said, because I'd told him that afternoon I couldn't keep doing this until he actually left you. He said he was finally going to tell you that weekend. He said it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in months. I sat in that car and felt something crack open in me that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden dizzying realization that the last 4 months of my marriage, the extra tenderness, the surprise dinners, the way he'd held my hand at his cousin's wedding, hadn't been Colin coming back to me. It had been Colin saying goodbye without the courage to say it out loud. I might have stopped there. Grief betrayal, a clean and terrible explanation, I could have buried it with him and moved forward angry but at peace with the facts as I understood them. But something about the accident report had started to itch at me, and once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. The report said Colin's car left the road at 9:47 p.m., but his final call to Bethany had ended at 8:26 p.m., That left an hour and 21 minutes unaccounted for on a route that took, according to my own drive of it, 2 weeks later exactly 19 minutes. I requested the full case file from the county, which, because the case had closed, as routine, took a records request, and 3 weeks of waiting to obtain. Buried in it was a detail the initial summary hadn't mentioned. Colin's phone had pinged a cell tower near a bar called Halloran's, 4 miles off his usual route home at 8:52 p.m. He'd stopped somewhere he had no reason to stop. I went to Halloran's myself on a Thursday night, the same night of the week he'd died, and showed the bartender a photograph. He remembered Colin said he'd come in agitated, ordered a whiskey he barely touched, and spent most of 40 minutes on the phone with someone voice-low pacing near the door. "Anyone with him?" I asked. "No, but he got a call right before he left. I remember because he looked at the screen and his whole face changed. Like whatever he saw scared him." The bartender didn't know who'd called, but Colin's phone records, which I now knew better than my own reflection, showed one more call that night, one I'd missed the first time because it came from a blocked number at 9:31 p.m., lasting 90 seconds. 16 minutes before the crash. I hired an investigator, a retired state trooper named Wade Ferris, who specialized in reopening cases that families believed had been closed too fast. I handed him everything: the folder, the timeline, the blocked call, the bartender's account. It took him 3 weeks to find what the original investigation never looked for, because the original investigation had no reason to look for anything. Wade pulled the toxicology report, which had been filed, but never flagged as unusual, since it showed no alcohol and no drugs. What it did show, buried in a footnote most people would never think to question, was a blood pressure medication in Colin's system at nearly triple his prescribed dosage, a medication he'd started taking only 2 months earlier for stress his doctor had attributed to a demanding work period. Wade also tracked the blocked number. It took a subpoena filed through the reopened case once Detective Ruiz, the officer Wade brought the new evidence to, agreed there was enough here to warrant a second look. The number traced to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a drugstore 11 miles from Colin's office. The purchase was captured on the store's security camera. The person buying it was a man named Trent Okafor, Bethany's husband. I hadn't even known Bethany was married. Neither apparently had Colin not, until according to a message Wade later recovered from a cloud backup of Colin's phone, Trent had found out about the affair 3 weeks before Colin died and begun sending him messages that escalated from angry to something closer to threatening. The final message sent the afternoon of the crash read simply, "We need to talk tonight. Don't ignore this again." Whether that call at 9:31 p.m. was the trigger for what happened next, whether Colin rattled and over-medicated and driving distracted after a confrontation none of us fully witnessed simply lost control on a wet bridge, or whether something more deliberate occurred was never something anyone could prove with total certainty. Trent denied any involvement in the crash itself when questioned, and the physical evidence at the scene degraded, after months of an unquestioned case couldn't establish more than what the toxicology and phone records already showed. But the medication discrepancy alone was enough to reopen the investigation formally, and enough finally for me to stop believing the story I'd been told at the very start. I didn't want a courtroom spectacle. I wanted the record corrected, and I wanted the people who'd let a story go unquestioned to have to look at it honestly. With Wade's findings and Detective Ruiz's support, the county reclassified Colin's death from a routine accident to an open investigation, citing the unexplained medication levels and the unaccounted-for hour on his final drive. Trent Okafor was brought in for formal questioning regarding the threatening messages and the prepaid phone. He was never charged with anything related directly to the crash, since intent and causation couldn't be established beyond doubt months after the fact, but the harassment messages were enough for a restraining order filed against him by Bethany herself, who left him within the month once the messages became part of the public record. I never got a courtroom moment where someone stood up and confessed. I've made peace with that. What I got instead was something quieter and in its own way more honest. Proof that my husband's death hadn't been the simple, tidy accident everyone assumed, and proof that the last months of our marriage had been more complicated, more human, and more unfinished than either the folder in the storage unit or the funeral eulogies had suggested. I closed the storage unit. I kept only one thing from it, a folded piece of paper I found tucked behind the checklist, a draft of a letter to me that Colin had apparently started and never finished. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was closer to a confession of someone trying badly and too late to explain a decision he hadn't yet had the courage to make out loud. I don't know how to tell you this without breaking something that took 9 years to build. I think I've known for a while that I broke it already quietly before I ever said a word. I'm sorry it took me this long to be honest. I'm going to fix that this weekend, I promise. He never got the weekend. Bethany reached out to me once more. Months later, not to explain herself again, but to tell me she was sorry. Genuinely, I believed her, and that she hoped I'd eventually find peace with a story that had no clean villain, only people who'd made choices that hurt each other in ways none of them fully intended. I don't know if I've forgiven Colin. I don't know if forgiveness is even the right word for what I feel now, which is something closer to a complicated, exhausted tenderness for a man who was trying in his own flawed and cowardly way to be honest before it was too late. Otis still sleeps in the middle of the bed. I've kept the morning walks rain or not because it turns out Colin was right. Mornings are for thinking, and I've done a lot of that this past year. I sold the house eventually. Not out of anger, but because I didn't want to keep living inside a story that had turned out to be only half true. I kept the unfinished letter, though. I keep it in a drawer I open maybe twice a year on the days I need reminding that people are rarely as simple as the version of them we bury. He was leaving. He was also in his own unfinished way trying to be honest about it before he ran out of time. Both of those things are true, and I've stopped needing them to make sense together. If you found out the person you trusted most had a checklist for leaving you, would you have looked for the truth the way I did, or let it stay buried? Tell me in the comments. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes they know the whole story of the people they love. Colin never got to finish his letter. I finished the story for him, not the one he was writing, but the one that was actually true.